Hi, everybody. It's the waitingfornextyear.com podcast from captivity in my basement. I am talking to interesting people in and around Cleveland because there are no sports to talk about. Back in the olden days, you might remember I used to do the podcast for Cleveland Scene magazine. One of the writers there at the time who helped me kind of launch that, who did a bunch of stuff with me, was Eric Sandy. He's since kind of moved on, although he continues to do stuff for Scene. He's on the line. How's it going, Eric?
Very, very good, Craig. Very good to be talking to you in these strange times.
I know, you too. You too. So before we go anywhere else, back in the Scene podcast days, we talked all the time. And since then, you've taken another gig. Why don't you tell everybody what you're doing now?
Yeah. So in, early 2018, I took a job at a Cannabis Business magazine. It is also based here in Northeast Ohio. So I was able to stick around Cleveland. And, we basically cover the emerging cannabis industry on a global level. We mainly focus on the U.S. and Canada, but we cover the cultivation of cannabis, product manufacturing, investments into the industry, the retail side, and then just last fall we launched a hemp-focused magazine, which is, hemp is cannabis. It's all the same plant. But hemp is the sort of more industrial side. It is now it's legal across the entire U.S. Ohio is going to start growing hemp this year, and that's the sort of thing that gets manufactured and processed into like fibers, the CBD oil everybody's talking about, and hemp seeds, which you can eat. A whole bunch of stuff, plastics even. So we've just got our finger on the pulse of all that, and it is a little bit ironic that it's sort of based here in Ohio. So we try to shine a light pretty heavily on all corners of the U.S., but for obvious reasons, the West Coast and places like Massachusetts and Illinois now, Michigan. So very exciting, little change of pace, but it's been a good learning experience. We've got a good team over there, pretty much mostly Cleveland people, but we've got a remote team as well. And I don't know. I've been a long time fan of the plant, so it's kind of nice to learn more about it.
Well, and it's an interesting beat too, because, and I'll save you the jokes about it being a quote unquote growth industry. Ha.
Absolutely.
But honestly, people are looking. I know people who have been looking to find stocks to invest in, for example, and people are trying to figure out how to get in on this gold rush, if as it were, and certainly. The front lines of this business story is taking place in places like Colorado and, Colorado was kind of one of the first, but so how much, obviously you're paying attention, you're reporting on these kinds of things. Do you ever go on assignment do you need to be in person to report some of these stories?
It's always preferable. Obviously, as a reporter in Cleveland, all those stories are always done at the place they're happening, or at least in person with interview subjects. With this one, it'd be great to be flying out to California more often, but it's not always possible, mostly for just budget and time reasons. So a lot of stuff is done over the phone. But I've built a pretty good network of sources, really all over the U.S. And we do get, we're frequently on the road traveling, mostly to places like, San Francisco and LA, Las Vegas is just a sort of a convenient meeting place, Denver, obviously. And in those experiences have been able to tour a lot of, extremely high tech, state of the art cultivation facilities, some very interesting dispensary environments, these extraction facilities where companies create edibles and cannabis infused beverages. So we try to get out as much as possible. But to be honest, the industry is just growing so fast, and there's so much money being poured into it that it's almost easier just to get on the phone constantly and meet people that way.
So I want to ask a little bit more in depth kind of about, what your reporting is on certain topics, especially as it relates to CBD, because the explosion of CBD around the country over the last probably 2 or 3 years, maybe I'm overstating it. Maybe it's only been 1 to 2 years, but it's been huge. I started using it myself. And when anybody asks me if it works, I always say, I think so. And when I say, and by saying, when I say, I think so, then it kind of works. But part of the reason that, that it is such an interesting story, I think, is because we haven't had a lot of research. We haven't had double blind tests and experiments on the effectiveness or efficacy of these substances. So where is the whole CBD thing? I mean, because at one point it was kind of illegal in certain spots, kind of like pot.
Yeah, it's that's probably the question I get the most from friends and family and everyone else.
Do you use it yourself?
I do, yeah. I've found kind of like you. I found it to work for me, and I'm thinking mostly of CBD tinctures that I've bought from hemp processors out of state that have gone through the testing and have sort of a paper trail to sort of read up on.
I buy gummies from New Jersey because I'm a child.
The gummies are great too. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy how many forms these things take. I guess to go to one of your points, and no, I don't get high. By the way, like they don't get you high. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly one misconception out there. They don't. These are products that don't contain any of the THC that has all the psychoactive properties. And I guess one thing to note is that to your point, there's not a lot of research done on these chemicals that are called cannabinoids. The CBD, the THC, there's about 120 plus known cannabinoids, and those are just the two big ones. And each of these chemical compounds affects each individual's endocannabinoid system differently. So, one product that has gone through testing and it has a certain level of consistency might do X for me. It might alleviate anxiety for me. It might make someone else jittery. It might have no effect on someone else. And it might need to be used it might need to be paired with a THC product to really draw out its efficacy. So that's one thing to know, is that it's sort of hard to just get product recommendations from a friend, knowing that it's going to be sort of different every time. The other flip side about CBD regulations in general is that the FDA has sort of been sitting on its hands for a while and not coming down on CBD products one way or the other. So what I mean by that is you can go into state legal dispensaries, and there's a whole bunch in the Cleveland area, and you can find CBD products in that environment. And that's an environment where the FDA is really not touching. These are state markets. But if you go to like stores in Cleveland or gas stations or what have you, non-dispensary environments, that's where the FDA is saying, hold on a second, you're essentially selling beverages or food products. We need to figure out what this is. So I would expect, obviously, things are a little hectic in Washington and elsewhere right now, but the FDA should be getting around to this at some point later this year and coming down and saying, all right, if you're a product manufacturer creating a CBD gummy or CBD tincture of some sort, here's the steps that you're going to need to go through. So until then, it is a little bit of the Wild West. It's this chemical compound that's it's not fitting into any other regulatory system right now. It's also
you know what it reminds me of, Eric, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but like,
oh no,
when I went down the path of becoming kind of the workout warrior, you walk into a GNC and stuff that's here today might be gone tomorrow. It's like an arms race between putting stuff out and then having it shut down and then changing your compound and putting something else out and then having it. And like nobody actually knows what's actually safe in a GNC. You can take something in a GNC that very might well kill you. Like it's,
Sure.
And I don't find CBD to be the same danger level, but the Wild West thing, you know, there's one thing. There are things in GNC also that, while not dangerous, probably don't do anything for you at all. And you spend tens and dozens of dollars on these things that don't have any impact whatsoever. And I kind of think CBD is in that realm right now where certain producers and certain compounds and certain production methods, we just don't know that much.
Right. I'd be very wary of the cure-all conversation that surrounds CBD. I think the marketing around CBD products is probably something that consumers should just sort of be critical of and be aware of. One other thing I would note, just because I think it's important here and gets lost in the conversation, is that CBD as a chemical compound is an active ingredient in an FDA-approved epilepsy medication called Epidiolex. And so because it exists as an active ingredient in a pharmaceutical drug, this goes back to the whole idea of, you can't go running around putting active ingredients in drugs into candy and selling it. So that's where the FDA is sort of realizing that it's got to move and figure out how to balance the pharmaceutical properties with the fact that consumers and medical patients, in a lot of cases, are finding relief from it without a prescription. So, we'll see how they come down on that argument. But yeah, in general, there's a lot of hype. The demand is pretty crazy, and it's hard to find a lot of clarity. We write a business magazine. Our audience is business owners and product manufacturers. So a lot of what we write about is probably not super helpful for consumers, but I always suggest that folks just pay very close attention to any testing records or paper trail that can be, associated with whatever product you're looking into.
So from the business perspective, there are two places I'd like to go. So number one, not in Ohio, a lot of the business around marijuana has struggled because of the federal regulation and whether or not it was federally legal. And then that leaked into kind of the banking regulations. And so I'm wondering if that's still the top of the heap in terms of problems with otherwise legitimate business owners around the country. And then after that, I'd like to get kind of to where we are in Ohio. But if you could speak to that first, I mean, is the banking thing still kind of the number one issue going on around the country with legal, state legal sales of marijuana?
Yeah, it is. So, these state licensed cannabis businesses, most of their transactions are happening in cash. They can't access traditional small business loans, which is obviously a very timely point right now. They don't have access to your usual bankruptcy proceedings or outlets, and they're hit with particularly onerous tax burdens. So these businesses are paying taxes, but they're treated as though, and I guess because technically they are, as though they're trafficking in controlled substances. So they're hit with some serious tax burdens. It's called IRS Code 280E. So between 280E and these banking issues, these businesses are up against some serious financial pressures. And right now, again, going back to the situation in D.C., the House of Representatives has passed a thing called the Safe Banking Act, which does a lot of things, but would essentially allow cannabis businesses to be treated like any other small business or any other business in the eyes of banks and lenders. That's sitting somewhere in a Senate committee room right now, probably just gathering dust. But that bill is sort of seen as a prerequisite to some form of federal legalization. There's a whole conversation about whether the current crisis is going to speed up the demand or the support for federal legalization, or whether it's actually going to have the opposite effect. We'll see what happens in the next couple of weeks and months. But yeah, banking is really, it's a huge, colossal problem. Even just down to like employee safety. I mean, they're handling cash, which is a sort of a public health concern right now in the moment, and it puts them, in sort of a precarious position, moving cash between places and sort of storing it on site. It's extremely tricky. Colorado and Washington started their sales in early 2014, so we're 6 years on in this, at least the recreational. I hesitate to say experiment, but at least in recreational sales in the U.S., 11 states have approved adult use recreational cannabis, and more are going to be coming soon. So the problem really needs to be solved, because you now have a lot of employees, a lot of investment capital, a lot of stuff tied up in this industry, and the federal government is continuing to sort of turn away from it. It's there's really it's hard to think of anything remotely comparable except for the Prohibition era, decades ago.
So I always think of this issue on the front lines where consumers are spending dollars for their product. But does this problem exist all the way up and down the supply chain from the grower to the dispensaries as well?
The banking problem?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it essentially affects, pretty much the entire supply chain.
I would have assumed so.
There's a couple different ways of looking at it, because only some businesses are what they call plant touching businesses. But if you're along that supply chain of growing cannabis, manufacturing products, selling these products to consumers, that's what we'd be talking about there. Then there's a whole spectrum of ancillary businesses that that's a bit of a gray area. Some of those are looked at as cannabis businesses, and some are just sort of like equipment manufacturers or vendors of one degree or another. But nonetheless, if these financial constraints are affecting the cultivator, that's going to affect all their contractors as well, anyone they're working with on the supply side.
So when you're talking to your sources around the country, or just you've got your finger on the pulse, you got to have a sense of what the world is thinking, this part of the world is thinking. Is there a sense that what we're going through with COVID-19 could somehow derail the momentum towards national legalization? Because, I mean, honestly, you'd have to be a crazy person to not to think that that's kind of the trajectory we're on.
Right. Yeah. The trajectory is certainly in place. The momentum is all there. You can, there's really no way of reading our president on this issue or any other issue, but he's at least made some statements that he'd prefer to hand it over to the states and at least pull back the federal pressure to keep it illegal and as a controlled substance. What I would bring up in this current moment as the only real tripwire I could see is, you're hearing this talk now of the federal government instituting some sort of stay-at-home order and essentially taking over that oversight of, you got to stay at home. What businesses are essential? What businesses are not essential? And the federal government making that sort of decision. Whereas you see it in Ohio and other states are allowing a lot of businesses to stay open, making sure other businesses stay closed, and getting into that whole essential business conversation. So my worry there, and I've heard it from others in the industry, is that if this gets in the federal government's hands, no matter the fact that cannabis businesses have been deemed essential in many states already in the last couple of weeks, the federal government doesn't recognize any of those businesses as even legal. So whether or not they're essential, it gets into a semantics thing.
Well, I find the word essential to be a total semantics thing across the board.
Yeah, well,
anyway,
it is, yeah.
Because And I see a lot of people specifically on Twitter and Facebook and other social media outlets getting kind of caught up in the word essential. And that's not really the standard that DeWine and his crew have set. They've really set the standard on, can this business operate in a somewhat safe and distanced manner? You know, grocery stores are essential, and they're essential, and the word applies. But like everything else, there seems to be more of a safety standard than actual essentiality as the standard.
Yeah. And for instance, you know, at the media company that publishes Cannabis Business Times, you know, media companies, I guess, have been, you know, we're allowed to continue operating.
Anybody protected by the First Amendment. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so I'm talking to you from my living room, but continuing to put out these magazines. And so you're right. So it gets into a strange situation. But I guess the worry there is that if the federal government does try to, take over the enactment or the implementation of that, cannabis businesses, again, are not even seen as legal businesses. So do they just, what happens at that point? It's sort of an open question. I think it's a reason to be a little concerned if you're a cannabis business owner, or if you're a registered patient who needs access to these products. But again, I mean, like with everything else the last couple of weeks, there's no way of saying. I would say that's the only real potential hurdle. In every other sense, yeah, you're right. The momentum is moving toward at least more and more states legalizing cannabis, more and more so through state house legislation rather than just the voters putting together a ballot initiative. But I mean, everything in Washington is totally screwy. I kind of thought the election year and this summer would put some pressure on Trump to just flip the switch, issue some sort of executive order that hands the power to the states and removes cannabis from the controlled substances list, almost as like a real cheap campaign move. But you know, everything's out the window right now in terms of how this election cycle is going to go.
Which leads us into Ohio. And yeah, I haven't been keeping up completely on it, but I'd like to first talk about what your perception is of the medical rollout and whether it's been, how it's compared to maybe some other states or other situations. That's number one. But number two, and maybe we should start here first before we get to how medical rolled out. It's my understanding that a lot of the legalization efforts require signatures, which require groups of people to go collect signatures, and that maybe, at least on the front lines here in Ohio, legalization has been derailed, if not slowed down massively.
Yeah. So the Ohio situation is very interesting, just a politically interesting state. The latest news there, and it's kind of ironic. I'm not totally tuned into Ohio as much as I might have been in earlier jobs as a Cleveland reporter. If only because there's not too much happening in the state. And so I've got my attention elsewhere. But the latest news is, there was a group that was putting together a petition for a ballot initiative for this November. And it was essentially framing the issue as, let's regulate marijuana as alcohol. Basically just copy all the alcohol language. That's how we're going to do it in Ohio. But the petition language was rejected by the Secretary of State maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. So at this point, whether they're going to revise that language, resubmit it, it's sort of unclear. Is it just a formality? I know that the Secretary of State often rejects petition language on the first go. Whether they'll get that language through and then be able to collect signatures, especially in this current situation we're all in, and get it on the ballot by November. I don't know. It's not super likely. I'm pretty sure the signature deadline, if they go that route, would be, usually in July, a couple months ahead of the election. So that's that. Not great news there.
So
there were a couple.
Not as a reporter, but just as a guy who's lived in the state for a long time, and in hindsight, and it's totally unfair, but obviously the last time we all got to vote on this, it was a really, really problematic law. It was not real great. It really kind of granted kingdoms to, I think, 6 people, if I remember correctly. But now in hindsight, we didn't pass that, and all this time has passed. Do you feel that maybe we would have been better off with a bad bill passing than failing?
Yeah, if only because, the sooner you legalize cannabis, the sooner you can do away with harsh criminal penalties at all, and you can sort of very quickly get into a normalization space where we can sort of all move on from the Prohibition era. I think that's one of the real main things. You can expunge past cannabis convictions, and anyone who got caught up in the criminal prosecution of cannabis possession can sort of just, get that out of their lives. The interesting thing that I've noticed since 2015 is that, yes, it was a very problematic initiative. It would have granted, the word monopoly was used, the word cartel was even used back then. It was essentially a bunch of like Texas payday lenders and Nick Lachey coming out to clamp down on this industry that they wanted to run in Ohio.
Don't forget Frosty Rucker, former defensive lineman.
Frosty Rucker, yeah. It was a bizarre collection of people.
I loved it. It
was fascinating. And you had the mascot, this Cannabis Bud mascot walking around. Just a very surreal moment.
I always just assumed that it would pass, and then it would take like a decade or two to unwind it. But by the time you get to national legalization and we're shipping stuff over state lines, then like it all sorts itself out over time. And I think your point about, the people who've been the convictions and all the interaction between marijuana and the legal system, I think that probably was worth more than having, the gold rush of weird people getting more money than they were due in the early days.
Yeah. There's no doubt that's very important here. The thing that I've come to notice though is, in 2015, this was pretty early in this very short history of recreational sales. And you only had states like Colorado and Washington that had pretty much opened the doors to an unlimited number of licenses. So small businesses were popping up all the time. And you can get into a whole argument about supply and demand and how that went for Colorado and Washington. But in Ohio, that initiative was essentially putting forth, a very limited number of licenses that were obviously going to be attached to this little cabal of characters. So that was a little unsettling. Now what we've come to find since then is that's pretty much the way it's going, is these states are now putting license caps on cultivation, manufacturing, testing labs, dispensaries. So the thing that we were worried about, this limited capacity, these limited license numbers, that's now the norm. Now, there's still an argument about the out-of-state actors who are trying to cash in on this. It was not a friendly initiative for Ohio entrepreneurs, but the general idea of a small number of beneficiaries has become pretty typical. Again, in 2015, though, it looked like, this is not how it's supposed to go. We're supposed to open the doors, and if you want to open a dispensary, the licensing fees are inexpensive. You can get your business going. If you were part of a community that was harmed disproportionately by the war on drugs, you'll be first in line for some, attention. If you're applying for a business license, there will be levels of support for you. And at the time, that wasn't baked into that initiative at all. And it's been a struggle ever since in other states to get that off the ground. So in hindsight, it's not a super unique situation, but I think because it was still so relatively early, the backlash was, understandable and pretty vocal. But, do I wish it had passed? I don't know. It's a very complicated question. Do I wish cannabis was legal in Ohio? Absolutely. There have been several attempts since then, including this most recent one I described, and nothing's getting off the ground. It's a tough state to to enact any progressive legislation, I guess.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. It's I think every state's like this. You go to New York State and you hit like the Buffalo side of the state. It's not the same as the New York City side of the state, and certainly all the space in between Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland, and maybe even Toledo. It's a lot of different states all wrapped up into one. We do have legal medical marijuana in the state now, and that kind of was a very small celebration. I kind of feel like they did the bare minimum in terms of rolling that out, but I have not partaken in that marketplace. I've not tried to get a prescription and I've never been to a dispensary, but the fact that I couldn't even tell you where one is, I think that probably speaks to the legal rollout of medical marijuana in Ohio.
Yeah. And I'm not a registered patient, and I honestly sort of have a hard time articulating to friends and family, how to go about getting a card and the whole process. I'm just not in that world. But based on my understanding, and just watching the regulatory and legal rollout, it was pretty slow. It was, fraught with lawsuits and internal fighting. A lot of the characters who'd been advocating for legalization going back years were now suddenly caught up and vying for one of these few licenses. And it just got pretty ugly. So where things stand now in early 2020 is we've got almost 50 dispensaries open, something like that. I know one just opened in Cuyahoga Falls recently, and there were at least there's one in Garfield Heights that's open. There's 2 in Cleveland and 2 in Lakewood. I'm not entirely sure if those are open, but for instance, the ones in Cleveland are one's over on Lakeside, east of downtown, and one is on Prospect in that sort of odd building where Prospect and Bolivar intersect, kind of by Playhouse Square.
Oh, the Triangle building.
The Triangle building, yeah. And so all the windows are covered up, but that's a dispensary called Rise, and they're in several states. I feel like that one may be open.
Okay.
Rise also has a license for the building next to Harry Buffalo in Lakewood, which is an interesting little intersection as well. I'm not sure if that one's open yet, though. But either way, about 50 dispensaries. There's about maybe 30 growers of different sizes. And I think, that's a product of, they were only going to roll out 24 cultivation licenses. There were tons of legal challenges. There's a very complicated scoring process to win these licenses, a lot of money. So they extended, I believe, 6 more licenses. You now have 30 growers. And each of those growers can expand their business, but they can't yet expand until all those growers are up and open, and that hasn't happened yet. So I guess my point there is that's the cap. These are the growers, those are the dispensary owners. Some of these companies are based in Ohio, and quite a few aren't. So it's not super different than the problems that we were talking about in 2015. I mean, obviously it's very different. We're talking about medical cannabis only here. Times have changed, but that's sort of the situation. So everything I've heard is, patients are happy that the industry is here. Product availability and inventory was sort of slow to roll out. Prices were high naturally. Ohio operates on its own sort of measurement scheme where they sell, for cannabis flower products, they sell tenths of a gram, or tenths of an ounce, I mean. And
see, none of this surprises me because, as I've kind of gotten into bourbon a little bit in the last couple of years, Ohio is last to get so many different things because of their wacky regulations, and people can't mark it up. And so the people who make bourbon make less money for every bottle they ship to Ohio. And it does not surprise me at all that regulation is fraught with wacky stuff.
Yeah. I mean, such is the way that the state operates. And, more and more of these businesses are opening, but it's almost in spite of the state's oversight. It's more of a testament to business savviness and agile business models where you have entrepreneurs and their staff who are able to weather a slow rollout and change their business models to fit the emerging regulations in Ohio. So it's I think it's a pretty good comparison. It's kind of no big surprise if you've lived in Ohio for more than a few weeks. This is sort of how we do things here.
All right. So last cannabis question before I want to touch on the fact that you still do some stuff with Scene and things of that nature. But so one of the most surprising things to me watching from afar as legalization is rolled out in other states is like people, at some point, do you see a situation where less than 10% of people who consume THC are doing so by smoke?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that particular.
Well, I made up the number, but it shocks me how many different ways we've discovered that humanity can take in THC that don't include burning it and inhaling it into your lungs.
Yeah, exactly. So in pretty much every market, most markets at least, cannabis flower is still the leading category. And that involves obviously smoking it, or you can actually vape the dry flower as well. So all that being said, I think your point is right though. Vape cartridges, like vaping this cannabis oil, has become very popular. It's discreet. A lot of these products are manufactured really well, very safely. But there's two caveats there. There's still not much research, not only on cannabis itself, but on or I guess how would you phrase this? Maybe vaporizing oil and inhaling it. I mean, just that act alone, there's not much research on. And as probably most folks are aware, last fall there was essentially this vaping crisis that emerged, and a lot of that had to do with illicit cannabis cartridges being made in people's basements that contained these like thinning agents, vitamin E acetate, some other chemicals that were causing essentially chemical burns in people's lungs.
Which, if you ask me, that's all. Again, that's because there's an inconsistency in regulation around the country. I mean, the idea is that, at least in my mind, that there's no way those things came from California or Colorado or any of the places where it's regulated and legal. Those came from places where people were trying to emulate the states where it is legal and producing it kind of on the black market.
Well, it's certainly true that where it's illegal, the illicit market will thrive. But interestingly enough, you go out to California, the illicit market is thriving out there. And I think that goes back to the tax burdens that are placed on licensed cannabis businesses. And, if you want to operate in the cannabis market, in the whole cannabis market, including legal and illegal, it's cheaper to just do it underground. Now it's illegal. It's holding up progress of the licensed market, but that continues to be a huge issue. So, a lot of these illicit carts are coming from California and other states like that.
Oh, wow. I find that shocking. I kind of figured it was more like the MP3 trade. And once Spotify comes out, everyone's like, why would I download an MP3?
Right. I mean, that's the strange thing. I think a lot of people, again, especially out west, these illicit cannabis markets, the whole network of dealers and guys and, texting, this has been going on for a long time, and it's hard to eradicate that because, especially if, depending on what sort of network you're in as a customer, you might have built up a lot of trust with the people you're buying from. It's probably, in some cases, maybe easier. So, there's a lot of interesting issues there that keep that market going. And California has a lot of work cut out for it. The other, I guess, side effect of the vape cartridge thing is once again, our president sort of flipped out and started cracking down on tobacco vapes. So the FDA is now, sort of tasked with, figuring that whole situation out. Not really sure where that's going. The other things I would mention real quick are edibles are kind of on the rise, I guess you might say. Super helpful and popular when you're just stuck at home all day in quarantine. There's a lot of interesting new types of edibles out there. And then cannabis beverages. And this is the one thing that I always like to highlight. I've run into these out west in Vegas and in California. Yeah, because that's
going toe-to-toe with Budweiser.
Exactly. And so there are a couple breweries that are brewing THC-infused beer with maybe, either non-alcoholic beer or, 0.5% alcohol, and then infusing THC. So it's brewed like an IPA, tastes like an IPA, and gets you high and not drunk. These things, these products, I can't recommend them highly enough. They're really incredible, and I sort of see the cannabis-infused beverages as probably the biggest either opportunity or most exciting aspect of the industry and the market right now. And I do think they're going to compete with alcohol companies like Anheuser-Busch and Constellation Brands, which owns Corona. They're pumping massive amounts of money into cannabis companies right now, specifically for this purpose. There's also, I guess, on a side note, there's a bit of a trend out there toward non-alcoholic beers. You've got Dry January, you've got
Sober
health
October.
And wellness blogs. Yeah, Sober October, all these things. So, I don't have too much of an opinion on that necessarily, but the whole non-alcoholic segment, I guess, is growing. And if you slot in a low THC non-alcoholic beer, the thinking is that, that's super relaxing. If it's going to affect everybody differently, but more than likely at a low dose like that, you're just going to feel relaxed. Imagine drinking these at a backyard party or even at a bar someday in the future.
Well, that's the question I have for you, because that's one of the biggest issues when legal marijuana rolled out in Colorado is you'd have these journalists going to California and buying an edible and not understanding dosage or anything else. So once it's in the beverage industry, what I assume you have some personal experience. What's the dosage level like, and does it feel more predictable than other kinds of edibles? In full disclosure, I have not been to a legal state. I've not tried any legal marijuana in any of these legal states, let alone their edibles or beverages.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, again, it's sort of different for everybody.
Sure.
These beverages I'm thinking of, without having the label in front of me, I believe it's something like 2 or 3 milligrams of THC. I'm not sure exactly what the ratio might be or how that's measured out, but it's a very low dose. On the gummy side, you commonly see, a single gummy being like 5 milligrams of THC. You might see 10 milligrams, and certainly in for medical cannabis patients, you can get up to 100 milligrams or beyond. But the dosing, for your regular, curious, recreational customer, it's hard to say beyond just trial and error. And, these edibles, they tend to, the word is titration. They tend to take a little while to take effect in your body. So you might eat one and not feel anything for a while, and then suddenly, it's hitting you in a much different way than smoking a joint or something might. So it's a little complicated. It's probably a really bad answer, but dosing is super important, and it's something to be cautious about, especially if you're, let's say you're on vacation in a state like Colorado. You want to enjoy all your time. Maybe you're in mixed company. You don't want to waste the night eating too much THC and freaking out,
tripping out. Yeah.
So yeah, you can always eat more or drink more as the night goes on, but you can't really eat less. So that's always the thing is, I guess, take it slow and learn.
It's always the damn tourists. They ruin everything.
It can get totally rowdy. Well, it's hard. I mean, you go out to Denver or wherever, and if you haven't been to a dispensary, it is a little bit like, everybody compares it to the kid in the candy store, or even some sort of Willy Wonka situation where it's overwhelming and it's easy to burn through a lot of money buying things that you can't buy in Cleveland right now, especially when you get into like these beers that I'm mentioning and just products that are unusual. So it is very exciting. It's very easy to overdo it, I guess, but a lot of interesting things happening, a lot of really, really cool, different types of products coming out.
All right. Well, we've already hit the limit of what I thought we were going to go, but if you have a few more minutes, I do want to talk about, the fact that you are still in Cleveland. You still get along with our good friends at Cleveland Scene. You've done some work with them.
Oh yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what you're up to there, if you don't mind.
So I've put out, let's see, in 2020 here, I've done 2 cover stories for them and just dropped another one, on Monday. So this would be, let's see, March, 30th. My last piece came out. These have all been, criminal justice related. When I was at Scene, for many years, I did a lot of music stuff, a lot of criminal justice reporting, courts reporting, a lot of environmental reporting. I mean, you wear a lot of hats, and you move very fast. And
we podcasted about a lot of those topics. It was fun.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, back in the day, we would get together and talk about that week cover story. Sam Allard was on frequently. Doug Tratner. I mean, it was, I can't say enough. It was a magical time. And the paper is, Scene is still doing what it can in these crazy times, still putting out some really, really great reporting on a threadbare staff. And again, I mean, really, really wonderful friends and amazing colleagues. And the Scene podcast archives are an incredible, incredible thing. So since then, I try to spend a lot of time doing freelance reporting. I love Scene and like writing for them. So these recent stories have involved questionable murder convictions, questions being raised in criminal prosecutions. The story I put out on March 30th involves a 1988 murder conviction that took place here in Cuyahoga County involving a guy named Melvin Bunnell. And he's been seeking physical evidence tied to his case, specifically for DNA testing purposes, for years. And the county has insisted that this evidence, they can't track it down. They're not sure where exactly it is. These are bullets and shell casings from the night of the murder on Bridge Avenue. And Bunnell's attorneys were given a chance to come down to the Justice Center, take a look through these boxes, just check all the records that exist in this case. And, right then and there, they open up this envelope that's got bullets and shell casings in it. So the question emerges of, was the county looking for these? What were they doing more or less in plain sight for the past many, many years? So that is there's documents being filed relating to that evidence being found.
And that's the top story on Scene right now.
I believe it is. Yeah. So this was came out on the 30th.
The amazing thing though is over the years talking to you and Sam and all the different writers that we've talked about who've covered these different kind of things, you'd think you'd run out, but we never seem to run out of these kinds of stories, which is amazing.
It is. It is amazing, and I think to be honest, I think it speaks volumes about the level or the lack of public accountability in a place like Cuyahoga County in the city of Cleveland, going back many, many, many years, way before my tenure. There's a lack of transparency about how business is being done. And I think there are valuable questions that need to be raised about the prosecutor's office, the county executive's office, name and office. Cleveland City Hall. And it sounds sort of glib to say, we should criticize these institutions, but we should take a close look at what's going on in the city, and we should continue to do so, especially in a very unsettling situation like we're in right now with the coronavirus outbreak, and certainly as fellow journalists in Cleveland get laid off at an alarming rate. I'm speaking to you on the day that the Plain Dealer is laying off more reporters.
I think it was
other
18.
staffers. Yeah, it's not fun and not a sign of a healthy news ecosystem. These are tremendous reporters. Scene had to go through this process a few weeks ago. I mean, obviously there are emerging economic pressures because of the coronavirus outbreak, but this is also part of a broader trend. I left Scene 2 years ago and have continued to write for the magazine and other outlets in Cleveland because I don't know. I mean, I'm tied to it. I love writing about the city. It's no one's out here getting rich writing about Cleveland, but there's a lot of stories. I mean, turn around and you'll find a story to write about. And if you have that sort of curiosity, it can carry you a long way. I guess I would also say, to the credit of certain institutions, I'm thinking of the county and the Justice Center in particular. If you push on public records laws, you'll get the records you're looking for. The city of Cleveland, not so much, not all the time. But if you know what you're looking for, you can usually find it, as evidenced by the bullets and shell casings I mentioned. I mean, it's all out there to be found, and there's a lot of stories to be written here. It's crazy.
Well, I appreciate your time, man. It's fun to catch up, even though we hit on a lot of heavy topics, I think.
Yeah.
But it was a little heavy, a little bit dense, but it was great to catch up, man. It's always fun to see what you're working on, and I'm glad things are going well with the Cannabis Business Times, and let's do it again sometime.
Most definitely, yeah. Maybe next time we'll talk about music and jam bands and stuff. Make it a little lighter.
Yeah, I give me the 30-second take, because it's and I know it'll be hard for a 30-second take, but behind the scenes at Waiting for Next Year, everybody was talking about the Fish album release, and I know that's way on your radar. So give me the 30-second review, and that's how we'll finish.
Right. Yeah. So on a couple nights ago, Fish announced that they were going to be debuting their new album during a live listening party on April 1st. The immediate thought is, oh God, are they going to drop some terrible April Fool's prank on us and get our hopes up and dash them? But yeah, April 1st that night, they put out a new album. I honestly think it's incredible. It speaks volumes about where the band is, 37 years into its existence. And I highly recommend it for all your quarantine listening.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. It's been the waitingfornextyear.com podcast.